Today, on Fish Memoirs, we're talking about a country that barely makes it into the headlines. And yet, it's where one of the most brutal wars on earth is being fought right now. A country where massacres have become routine, where entire cities are being reduced to rubble, and where millions of people are fleeing a conflict that almost nobody really understands. And of course, when chaos takes over, rumors start to spread. That it's a religious war, that there's a genocide against Christians, that the West is hiding the truth, but how much of that is actually true? What's really going on in Sudan? Who's fighting whom? And what role does religion really play in all this? Well, let's find out. Sudan is one of the poorest countries in the world, and that's despite being bathed by the Red Sea, crossed by the mighty Nile, and sitting on rich deposits of oil, gold, silver, tungsten, iron, and zinc. The problem? Sudan has been trapped for decades in a spiral of political instability, internal wars, deep inequality, and above all, corruption. Endless corruption. To start this story, we need to go back to the late 1980s, a time when a military officer named Omar al-Bashir carried out a coup d'etat and seized power, turning himself into a dictator. Al-Bashir built a corrupt and tyrannical regime where he siphoned off at least $9 billion from state funds for his own personal use. And if that wasn't enough, the man was later indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. During his rule, Sudan was dragged into multiple conflicts. But the most devastating of all was the Second Sudanese Civil War. It became one of the longest and deadliest wars in African history, lasting 22 years and claiming over 2 million lives. In the end, that war led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. But when you add that kind of conflict to decades of corruption, poverty, and internal tensions, you get a ticking time bomb that was bound to explode sooner or later. And the spark that finally set it off? The end of subsidies on wheat and fuel, which triggered the Sudanese Revolution of 2018. Massive protests erupted across the country, and al-Bashir had no choice but to step down. After his fall, a transitional military council took control, basically a military junta that ruled until the creation of a sovereign council of Sudan. This new council was a hybrid government made up of both civilians and military officers, tasked with leading the country toward democracy while trying to represent its many ethnic and religious groups. In total, the Sovereign Council consisted of 5 civilians, 5 military leaders, and 1 additional member chosen by consensus between the two sides. But as happens in many African countries, the military really likes being in charge. So the democratic experiment didn't last long. In 2021, the generals got angry and staged another coup, this time led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. So far it all sounds pretty straightforward. We've got the military back in power, just like in the days of the old dictator. We've got civilian groups demanding democracy. And we've got ethnic and religious minorities completely left out of political life, often clashing with the government in Khartoum. On top of that, Sudan's also dealing with tensions with its southern neighbors. So naturally, you'd think that's where the next big problem would come from, but nope. Here's where the story takes a twist. Up to this point, I haven't mentioned something crucial. In Sudan, the military isn't a single unified force. There's the official army, yes, but there are also several militias, and among them, one stands out above the rest, the Rapid Support Forces, better known as the RSF. The RSF, mostly made up of Arab fighters, had been doing the dirty work of the Sudanese government since the days of dictator Omar al-Bashir. They first made headlines back in 2016 when the regime tried to crush uprisings in the southern region of Darfur through brutal ethnic cleansing against anyone who wasn't Arab. That campaign, known as the Darfur Massacres, left around 300,000 people dead, and the RSF were the main executioners. Since then, these guys have only grown stronger. They've recruited more and more fighters and even taken control of several gold mines across the country. The problem is, they got too powerful. So powerful, in fact, that they began to rival the national army itself. Worried about this growing threat, the Sudanese army tried to start a process to integrate the RSF into its ranks. But before that could happen, the RSF, led by their commander Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hemeti, rebelled. They began deploying troops across the country, even in the capital, Khartoum. There, the RSF seized the airport, took over the national TV station, and fierce battles broke out around the presidential palace and other key points in the city. The government responded by launching airstrikes against the rebels, and while the RSF doesn't have an air force, they do possess anti-aircraft weapons. Today, the RSF fields around 100,000 soldiers, enough to control vast areas of Sudan. Meanwhile, the Sudanese army has roughly twice that number, making this a deadly balance of power that's tearing the country apart. Although this war is mainly a struggle for power and gold, between two military factions, there's also a geographical background behind it. Let's break it down. On one side, we have the Sudanese army, dominated by the Arab elite of Khartoum from the Nile Valley. On the other side, we have the RSF, made up mostly of Arab militias from Darfur, the same groups that were once armed by Omar al-Bashir's regime to crush non-Arab African uprisings in that region. So what we're seeing now isn't a religious war, nor a clash between Arabs and Africans, like in the 2000s. It's an internal fight among Arab elites competing for power and resources. Still, in recent months, we've heard a lot about the massacres committed by the RSF, atrocities that some media outlets have even described as a genocide against Christians. But is that really true? The short answer is no. The latest killings carried out by the RSF have been concentrated mainly in West Darfur, especially around the city of El Geneina. These attacks have targeted the Masalit community, an African non-Arab ethnic group. The Masalit are sedentary farmers, mostly Muslim, who have long competed over land and water with Arab nomadic tribes that support the RSF. So this isn't a religious conflict, nor a campaign against Christians. It's an ethnic Arab offensive against African communities that, in fact, are mostly Muslim. That doesn't mean no Christians have been killed, but there's no genocide targeting Christians as such. Another key part of this story is who's supporting each side. Let's start with the Sudanese army. They're backed by Egypt, their longtime ally. Several East African countries, like Eritrea and South Sudan, also maintain ties with the army, mostly because they fear the chaos could spill across their borders. Outside Africa, the army has tried to gain international recognition by presenting itself as the legitimate authority of Sudan. Meanwhile, the RSF has built a very different kind of network, less formal, but far more profitable. Their main backer is the United Arab Emirates, which has supplied them with weapons, drones, and funding, channeled through Chad and Libya, where they're supported by General Haftar. In return, the RSF controls Darfur's richest gold mines, gold that often ends up in the markets of Dubai. They've also developed close ties with Russia through the Wagner Group, which has provided training and access to arms smuggling routes from the Central African Republic. And here's an interesting twist. Because of those links with Russia, Ukrainian special forces have reportedly appeared in Sudan, supporting the government's side in isolated operations. And with all that said, there's only one question left. How is the war going? The RSF, which already had a strong presence in the West, took advantage of their mobility and looser structure to move quickly. In Khartoum, they seized entire neighborhoods, occupied the airport, and besieged major military compounds, while the army fought back with heavy artillery and airstrikes launched from its base in Wadi Saidna. The capital turned into a ghost city, millions trapped among ruins and snipers. As the fighting dragged on in Khartoum, the decisive front shifted west to Darfur, Hemeti's home region and the historical heart of the RSF. There, the RSF unleashed a ferocious offensive. Within weeks, they captured El Geneina, Niala, Zalingay, and al-Bashir, key cities that gave them control over almost the entire western half of Sudan. It's in those areas where the worst atrocities have taken place: mass killings of the Masalit people, public executions, sexual violence, and the systematic burning of villages. Meanwhile, the army managed to hold the north and the east, especially around Port Sudan, which became al-Burhan's new headquarters and the government's main connection point with Egypt. In the center of the country, places like South Kordofan and Blue Nile turned into war zones where, besides the RSF and the army, local rebel groups also took up arms again, taking advantage of the chaos. That fractured the map even more, turning the conflict into a war of positions with no clear front line. Throughout 2024 and 2025, the RSF consolidated its grip on the west and maintained parts of Khartoum, while the army resisted in the north with Egyptian air support. So far, neither side has won. The country is split in two: a formal government in Port Sudan, a parallel military power in Darfur, and vast areas ruled by warlords where the state simply no longer exists. Meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis in Sudan is devastating and almost invisible to the rest of the world. More than 10 million people have been forced to flee their homes, making it the largest displacement of people on the planet today. Cities lie in ruins, hospitals have been destroyed or looted, and famine is spreading at a relentless pace. Over 20 million Sudanese now depend on urgent aid just to survive. In places like Darfur or Khartoum, civilians are trapped between snipers, sexual violence, and blockades that keep food and medicine from getting in. Humanitarian organizations can barely enter the country. And in the meantime, Sudan sinks deeper into a silence broken only by hunger and gunfire. Sudan is bleeding far from the cameras, while the international community simply looks the other way. That's all for today's video. You know the drill. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, hit subscribe, and dive in for the next one.